Well, we're spending, as I said, our second week exploring this question, where does it hurt? And it's a great question because it doesn't ask if we are hurting. It knows we are hurting, and it treats our pain as valid and as worthy to be shared with one another. But the where part of that question, it can be problematic for some of us, right? You see, sometimes we know exactly where it hurts, and we know exactly what's causing it. But other times we can't quite locate our pain or its source. We just know we are in pain, and we need help figuring out where it is and what is causing it. I was at the doctor the other day. I've been experiencing some unexplained joint pain lately, strange for my age. So my doctor asked me this very question: where does it hurt? And while I could pinpoint a few spots that were particularly bad, the honest answer was everywhere, every joint. It hurts everywhere. And I'm frankly not quite sure what the source of it is or what's causing it. I reminded myself in that moment a lot of my son Jacob. Because of his neurological and sensory conditions, doctors have told us that it's possible Jacob doesn't feel localized pain the way most of us do. When a part of his body is injured or sick, he feels it in other parts or just all over. He feels off, and we can tell he's off, but it's really hard to identify where it hurts or where the pain is coming from, which of course can make it nearly impossible to treat. It occurs to me that for many of us, at this point in the pandemic, our answers to that question are similar. Where does it hurt? Well, here, here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here, really just everywhere. At first, I think we could identify some localized pain. There was some loneliness, some grief, some stress, but now I think it's harder to pinpoint. And some weird things are cropping up. I've heard some of your stories, I know some of my own. We're edgy with others. We don't know why. After months of longing to regather in community, we're now finding that, weirdly, we've got these invisible mental or emotional blocks or hurdles that make it hard to do so. And some of us are finding that we're actually pulling away from others despite our need for community. It's been harder than we expected to come back. And the anxiety and the grief of the pandemic, it's gone on for so long that it feels like it's just spread, engulfed us. Any stress or loss we experience now feels all the more heightened. The loss of a loved one, stress at work, relationship trouble with our partner, financial worry, grief over the continued lack of normalcy to life, dreams or callings that we put away on the shelf, thinking we'd get them right back out again soon. Where does it hurt? For many of us, the honest answer to that right now is all over. It hurts all over. A nurse from my doctor's office called the week after I went in for my first round of blood tests. It had been a particularly bad week of joint pain. We got the results back, she said. Good news. Everything looks normal. Except that wasn't good news for me, right? You're chuckling, you know. That meant that we were back to square one, that we still didn't have any clue about what was causing my pain. And I hung up the phone, and I noticed that I actually had some tears starting to run down my cheeks. I had carried so much hope into those blood tests, hope that I might soon find some treatment or at least some relief from the pain. I was so discouraged that we hadn't been able to locate that pain or where it was coming from. Hearing we can't find anything wrong wasn't the good news I had been holding out for. Well, the woman in our story this morning, she's been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years. Can you imagine? That means not only is she physically feeling weak and ill, but socially and emotionally as well. Because women were excluded from regular community life when they were bleeding. Here's what Leviticus says in the midst of its ritual purity laws about bleeding women. It says, when a woman has her regular flow of blood, the impurity of her monthly period will last for 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean till evening. Anything she lies on during that time will be unclean. Anything she sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches anything she sits on will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. Whether it is the bed or anything she was sitting on, when anyone touches it, they will be unclean till evening. And it goes on to say, when a woman has or is bleeding for many days at a time other than her period, she also will be considered unclean, and anyone who touches her will also be unclean. It's the way we treat highly contagious people carrying infectious disease like, say, COVID, right? That's how she's been treated for 12 years. 12 years of quarantine. So I imagine this woman as someone deeply, profoundly lonely and hungry for community. She's been quarantined, socially distanced from others for 12 years with no answer and no end in sight. We're told she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and that she had spent all of her money, all that she had, and yet she still wasn't getting better. Instead, she grew worse. Some of us, I know from the chuckles this morning, some of us can relate to that, right? We've had experiences like that. And it's maddening and discouraging not to get answers, a cure, or a treatment. To not even have a name for the condition from which we're suffering. How do we share our pain with others when we don't even have a name for it? I wonder when the last time was that this woman touched another human being. They say we need at least 8 hugs a day to be healthy. But as a bleeding, ritually unclean woman, no one has probably touched her in a really long time. Which is why it's so bold that she takes that risk to reach out and touch Jesus' cloak. And it's why it must have terrified her when he actually noticed what she had done. She probably shouldn't have even been in the middle of that crowd while she was bleeding, because she would make anyone unclean who touched her. Right? It's like someone with COVID going into the middle of a crowd. Anyone could catch it from her. At least that was the thinking then. But she's desperate. So she reaches out and she touches. And immediately, she's healed. And while that is miraculous, it's this 12-year prayer finally answered, I think the real miracle might be that Jesus actually stops and takes notice of her pain and praises her desperation to find healing. He actually calls that desperation faith. When I asked all of you last week, why is that question, where does it hurt? Why is it so hard for us to ask that of one another? Someone responded, because it might trigger our own pain. And another one responded, well, we can barely deal with our own pain, let alone another's. So it might be overwhelming. And then another person said, because we'll feel the need to fix their pain, and we might not be able to. So it might be really discouraging. You see, we have this awareness, right? That if we allow someone to share their pain with us, we allow their pain to touch us, it's going to cost us something. I think perhaps without even being conscious of it, many of us think about it as this big zero-sum game. And if we tend to someone else's pain, we might not have enough left to tend to our own. Jesus notices that this woman touched him because he feels power go out from him. It's cost him something. But he's not mad or resentful. When he discovers who has touched him and why, he's glad to let her take a little of his power. And I don't think it's just because Jesus is somehow superhuman and doesn't have the same human limitations that all the rest of us do. I think it's because he has faith and this deep, intimate connection with God. He knows that while his human power might be limited, God is not. God is endless, this deep well, and he can draw from that well whenever his own power runs out. And so even though it costs him something, even though he feels that power leave him when he touches this woman's pain, he doesn't have to worry about having enough to care for himself or those closest to him, his disciples or his family. He can touch her pain because God will replenish whatever is spent in this encounter. Friends, I know that many of us are feeling spent. And at this point in the pandemic, feeling like we have little to offer each other. Like whatever emotional power or resources we do have need to go into our own self-care because we are hurting. Some of us are falling apart. You know, it's kind of like the flight attendants tell you, right? Secure your own oxygen mask first. Self-care is important, and knowing our limits is important, and it is important to care for ourselves so that we can care for others. And it's still possible to touch each other's pain even when we ourselves are hurting and falling apart. Any of us who engage in ministry, and by that I simply mean any of us who engage in building the beloved community, anyone who participates as a member of the body of Christ, living the Jesus way of love in the world, we are all what contemporary theologian Henry Nouwen calls wounded healers. And we follow a wounded healer. Most of our images of Jesus, right, are of Jesus bleeding on the cross or resurrected, but still with the marks of the nails, the scars on his hands and his feet. And yet we believe that somehow in Jesus' woundedness, we can still find comfort and power and healing. I've discovered through my years of ministry that somehow through faith, I can tap into that endless well of God's restorative power. And I can somehow reach out and touch other people's pain, even when I myself am hurting or falling apart or don't feel like I have enough to give. I know many of you have experienced that too. But every once in a while, we need that reminder that there is that well for us, that we don't have to tend to other people's pain on our own power, because sometimes we really don't have enough. But God always does. And God's power empowers us to care for each other, even when we are carrying wounds and scars, even when our energy is drained, even when our minds or our hearts or our bodies are weak or tired. So this week, let's not be afraid to ask each other, or even ask a stranger, where does it hurt? Where does it hurt? God help us and refill us as we do. Amen.